The first time I heard the voice, I thought I was losing my mind. I was standing in the kitchen of my new apartment at 2 a.m., unable to sleep because of the move and the stress, and the general sense of dislocation that comes with starting over in a place where you don't know anyone. The apartment was in an old building downtown, the kind of place that had character, but also had the smell of decades settled into its bones. I'd gotten a deal on it because the previous tenant had left suddenly, and the landlord was desperate to fill the vacancy. $400 cheaper than market rate, which meant something was wrong with it, but I couldn't afford to be picky anymore. Not after everything. I was standing at the counter drinking herbal tea that tasted like punishment when I heard it. A voice. Soft, almost like a whisper, but distinct enough that I could make out the syllables. It seemed to come from inside the wall itself, from somewhere behind the cabinet where I kept my coffee mugs. I froze, my hand halfway to my mouth, the tea growing cold in my grip. For a moment I told myself it was the building settling. Old buildings made noises, pipes knocked, wood expanded, walls talked to each other in the language of age and decay. But this wasn't the sound of a building communicating with itself. This was a voice, a human voice, and it had said my name, not yelled it. Not called it out in question, just stated it, as if confirming something, as if checking a box on a list. Claire, it had said, just that. Just my name, spoken in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away, even though the wall was right in front of me. I set down my tea with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet apartment. I pressed my ear against the wall, feeling foolish and terrified in equal measure. Nothing. Just the silence of an old building at 2 a.m., pressing in from all sides. I waited for several minutes, my ear against the cool paint, but there was nothing else. No explanation, no second voice, just the sound of my own heartbeat and the distant hum of the city outside my window. I told myself I'd imagined it. Stress does strange things to the mind. Moving across the country after a divorce, leaving behind everything familiar, starting a new job at a company where I didn't know anyone. It was enough to make anyone hear voices. I went back to bed and lay awake until dawn, watching the light gradually illuminate the ceiling of my bedroom, trying very hard not to think about the voice and what it might mean. The voice came again 3 nights later. This time I was in the bedroom, lying in bed trying to read a novel that couldn't hold my attention. The walls of the bedroom seemed thinner than the walls in the rest of the apartment, or maybe that was just my imagination making everything feel more fragile since the first incident. I was on page 70-something of a book that had been recommended to me by a friend back home. The kind of book that was supposed to change your life, but was instead just making me feel more depressed about humanity. The voice came through the wall behind my bed, speaking in the same distant whisper as before. This time it didn't just say my name, it said something more. You're not supposed to be here. The book fell from my hands. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Who's there? I called out, and my voice sounded small and frightened in the empty apartment. Who's talking to me? There was no response, just the same oppressive silence as before, except now it felt different. Now it felt like the silence was listening. Like the apartment itself had turned its attention to me and was waiting to see what I would do next. I got out of bed and turned on every light in the apartment. I checked the locks on both the front door and the back door that led to the fire escape. I looked in the closets and under the bed like I was 5 years old again, terrified of monsters. But there was nothing. No one. Just me and the empty apartment and the growing certainty that I was either losing my mind or something profoundly strange was happening. I considered calling the landlord. I considered calling the police. I considered calling my ex-husband, even though we hadn't spoken in 8 months except through lawyers. But what would I say? That I was hearing voices in my apartment. That a disembodied voice knew my name and told me I wasn't supposed to be somewhere. They would think I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. In the end, I did nothing. I sat on my couch with all the lights on and watched the night gradually turn into morning, and I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. The building had shared walls. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe someone in the adjacent apartment was watching me through a crack or speaking through the pipes in some elaborate prank. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me because I was exhausted and stressed and grieving the life I'd left behind. By the time sunlight was streaming through the windows, I'd almost convinced myself that one of these explanations was true. Almost. The voice came again the next night, and the night after that. Each time it said something different, but it always knew things it shouldn't know. personal things, things I hadn't told anyone, things I barely admitted to myself. On the fourth night, when the voice emerged from the wall, it said, "I know about the pills." Just that. Just 5 words that managed to encompass everything I'd been trying to hide. The pills I kept in my nightstand drawer, the ones I'd started taking after the divorce was finalized. The ones my therapist didn't know about because I'd never told her they existed. The ones I'd promised myself I was only using temporarily, just to get through the transition. I pressed my face against the wall. "What do you want?" I whispered into the darkness. "Why are you doing this?" The voice was silent for a long moment, and I thought maybe it was gone. But then it came again, softer this time, almost gentle. "I'm trying to help you." The impossibility of this statement hung in the air between us. "Help me with what?" I asked. "Help me understand what's happening. Help me figure out if I'm going crazy." The voice didn't answer immediately. When it finally came, it sounded almost sad. "You're not going crazy. You're just finally hearing what's been here all along." I'm the apartment, Claire. I'm the walls and the floors and the foundation. I'm the history of everyone who's ever lived here, and I know them all. And I know you. I've been waiting for you for a very long time. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next night either. Instead, I sat in my apartment and waited for the voice to speak again, and when it did, I found myself listening not with fear, but with a strange kind of fascination. The voice, and I'd started thinking of it as a voice now, singular and intentional. Not just the product of a fractured mind, seemed to know everything about me. It knew that I'd spent the first 3 weeks in the apartment crying in the shower, because that was the only place I could cry without feeling like I was falling apart completely. It knew that I'd called my mother 5 times and hung up every time before she answered, because I didn't want to tell her that the new job and the new apartment and the new life weren't working out the way I'd hoped. It knew about the deleted dating app on my phone, the one I'd downloaded at 2 in the morning after 3 glasses of wine, and deleted at 3 in the morning when I realized I couldn't face the prospect of explaining myself to strangers. The voice knew all of this, and it seemed to understand in a way that nothing else in my life did. Over the course of a week, my fear transformed into something else. Not acceptance, exactly, but a kind of desperate curiosity. If I was going insane, then this was the most elaborate delusion my mind could construct. It was specific and consistent and annoyingly helpful. The voice began offering advice. Small things at first. On the day I called in sick to work again, the voice told me I should take a walk to the coffee shop 3 blocks away, that the owner would recommend a drink I'd love, that I needed to get out of the apartment. I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay in bed and pull the covers over my head and pretend the outside world didn't exist. But the voice was persistent, almost gentle in its insistence. So I went. And the coffee shop owner, an elderly man named Vincent, recommended a drink I'd never heard of, a combination of espresso and cardamom and honey that somehow managed to taste exactly like comfort. We talked for 20 minutes, and by the end of the conversation, he told me about the job opening at his coffee shop's sister location, a position that involved less corporate drama than my current job. "I have a feeling you're going to need a change," he'd said, and I'd laughed because the universe had apparently decided to speak to me through the mouth of a man who made coffee for a living. When I got back to the apartment, I pressed my hand against the wall. "How did you know?" I asked. "How could you possibly know about the coffee shop?" The voice came immediately, as if it had been waiting for me. "I know everything that happens near these walls, Claire. I've been here for 117 years. I've watched people come and go. I've absorbed their stories. I've learned their secrets, and I can feel things before they happen. I can sense possibilities. I could sense that you needed someone kind today, and Vincent is kind. I directed your feet toward him." At first, I thought the voice was playing with me, embellishing the truth to make itself seem more magical, more powerful. But as the days went on and the voice continued to prove itself in small ways, I began to wonder if maybe it was telling the truth. Or at least, a version of the truth that made more sense than anything else in my life currently made. The voice never appeared during the day. It only spoke when I was alone in the apartment at night, and it seemed to prefer the walls of my bedroom and kitchen. I started leaving it notes, little questions written on sticky notes that I'd press against the wall, asking if the voice could read them. The response was always the same. "I can feel the intention behind your words, Claire. I can sense what you're asking even if I can't read the exact letters." This seemed like a convenient limitation. It allowed for ambiguity, for interpretation, for the possibility that I was making it all up. But I was increasingly convinced that I wasn't. There was a consistency to the voice that my own mind couldn't sustain. It knew details about the building's history that I later verified by looking up old newspaper archives online. It knew about the woman who'd lived in my apartment in 1987 and had been an artist. And when I spoke to the building's superintendent, he confirmed that yes, there had been an artist living here then, someone who'd painted murals on the walls before moving to New Mexico. The voice knew about the man who'd lived here in the 1940s and had been a jazz musician, and I found a reference to him in a digitized record of a local newspaper that listed him as one of the performers at a nightclub that had burned down in 1952. The voice knew things, real things, verifiable things, and it knew me. It knew me in ways that even I was still learning about myself. One night, about 2 weeks after I'd first heard the voice, I sat on my bed and asked it the question I'd been avoiding. "Are you real?" The voice was silent for so long that I thought maybe it wasn't going to answer. But then it came, quieter than usual, almost vulnerable. "I'm as real as anything can be, Claire. I'm real because you're hearing me. I'm real because I'm changing your life. I'm real because I exist in this space and you exist in this space, and that makes us real to each other. Whether I'm real in any other way, whether I exist in your mind or in the walls or in some space between the two, does it matter?" It was a good question. And I realized that for the first time since my divorce, since moving to this new city and this new apartment and this new version of my life, I didn't feel entirely alone. The voice had become my confidant, my companion in the darkness, my guide through a landscape that I was only beginning to understand. And I didn't care if it was real in any conventional sense. It was real enough for me. It was the first real thing I'd felt in months. By the end of the first month, I'd quit my job at the corporate firm and taken the position at Vincent's coffee shop. I told myself it was a lateral move, a chance to reassess. But the truth was that the voice had suggested it, and I'd come to trust the voice's judgment more than my own. The voice had been right about the coffee shop, about Vincent, about the fact that I needed to be around people who genuinely cared about each other rather than people who were just competing for the next promotion. Vincent hired me on the spot, and when I explained that I'd need flexible hours because I was dealing with some personal issues, he'd nodded like he understood the whole story without me having to tell it. At night, when I came home exhausted from learning the rhythms of the coffee shop, from memorizing drink recipes and customer names, the voice would be waiting. It would talk to me about the customers who'd come in that day, and it would often know things about them that were remarkably specific. It would know that the elderly woman who came in every Tuesday morning had lost her husband 3 months ago. It would know that the young couple who sat in the corner booth was having relationship problems and would probably break up within the month. It would know that the businessman who always ordered coffee black and bitter was currently being investigated for fraud and would be arrested within a week. At first, I'd been disturbed by the voice's seemingly omniscient knowledge, but gradually, I came to understand that the voice wasn't reading minds or seeing the future. It was simply observant in the way that only a 100-year-old building could be. It had absorbed the emotional states of everyone who'd passed through its doors. It had learned to read human behavior by watching it repeat across decades. It had become wise because it had been witness to so much. I began to think of the voice not as something supernatural, but as something natural. A consciousness that had emerged from layers of history and human presence. A mind that had been built not in a single moment of awakening, but gradually, through years of observation and experience. One night in early October, about 2 months after I'd first heard the voice, I asked it something that had been bothering me. "Why me?" I said to the wall. "Why did you start talking to me? Why not reveal yourself to someone else?" The voice took its time answering. When it finally came, it sounded almost hesitant. "Because you were ready to listen, because you needed to hear it, because you were standing on the edge of making a terrible choice, and I could feel that. When you pressed your ear against my wall that first night, I recognized something in you, a need, a desperation, a willingness to believe in something beyond the normal world. You were reaching out even if you didn't know it, and I answered." I thought about this for a long time. It was true that I'd been desperate. It was true that I'd been on the edge of something when I moved into the apartment. I'd been taking the pills with increasing frequency. I'd been calling out sick from work more and more often. I'd been disappearing, becoming less and less substantial with each passing day. Maybe if the voice hadn't spoken to me when it did, I would have continued disappearing until there was nothing left of me at all. What if I'd chosen someone else? I asked. What if I'd chosen a different apartment? The voice's response was immediate. You wouldn't have. You chose this apartment because part of you knew I was here. Part of you recognized that I existed before you ever walked through the door. That's how consciousness works, Claire. It calls to itself across time and space. You were meant to find me. I was meant to find you. Around this same time, I stopped taking the pills. I didn't make a dramatic decision to stop. I just woke up one morning and realized I hadn't taken them in 3 days and I didn't miss them. The voice had something to do with it, though it never directly told me to stop. Instead, it simply kept directing me toward healthier choices. It told me when I needed to eat, when I needed to sleep, when I needed to go for a walk and clear my head. It created a structure around my life that had been missing since the divorce. My mother called one evening, and I actually answered. For the first time in months, I was excited to talk to her. I told her about the coffee shop job, about Vincent, about the apartment, and the community I was building. I didn't tell her about the voice. That would have been too strange, too difficult to explain. But I told her that I'd found something that made me feel alive again. I'm proud of you, she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. She'd been worried. Of course she'd been worried. I'd been falling apart, and she'd been trying to catch me from across the country with phone calls I wouldn't answer and emails I would read but not respond to. Now, finally, I was reaching back. I was engaging with life again. I was becoming whole. But there was a darker side to my connection with the voice, something I tried not to think about too hard. The voice had knowledge that I couldn't explain. It knew things about people that it had no business knowing. It would tell me specific details about customers' lives, things that seemed to come from nowhere. And when I started paying attention, I realized that the voice's predictions about people's futures were remarkably accurate. The businessman was arrested exactly a week after the voice had predicted it. The young couple in the corner booth broke up on a Monday morning, just as the voice had said they would. The voice's knowledge extended into the future in ways that didn't make sense. Are you seeing the future? I asked it one night. Or are you just making good guesses? The voice's response was evasive in a way that it usually wasn't. I'm not seeing the future exactly. I'm seeing patterns. Human behavior is predictable if you understand the patterns. The businessman was nervous because he was afraid of being caught. His fear was visible if you knew how to look for it. The couple was pulling away from each other, creating distance. Distance is a precursor to separation. These aren't predictions, Claire. They're inevitable outcomes based on current trajectories. But even as the voice explained it this way, I had the sense that there was more to it than that. That the voice's knowledge extended into places that science couldn't explain. That maybe the voice wasn't just a consciousness that had emerged from the building's history. Maybe it was something else entirely. Something that existed outside of normal time. Something that saw the world in a way that humans couldn't. And I realized that I didn't care. Whatever the voice was, whatever it knew, it had saved my life. It had given me a reason to stay when I'd been ready to disappear. It had given me purpose and community, and a sense that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. If that meant accepting that I was living with something I didn't understand, something that knew things it shouldn't know, then that was a price I was willing to pay. Winter came early that year, turning the city into a landscape of gray and white, and cold that matched something deep inside me. But unlike previous winters, when I would have withdrawn completely, this one found me engaged with life in ways I hadn't expected. I was working at the coffee shop 5 days a week, and the routine had become something I looked forward to. The regulars started to feel like family. The elderly woman who came in every Tuesday and ordered chamomile with honey and a croissant became someone I checked in with. The businessman who ordered black coffee, before his arrest, became someone I felt genuine sadness for when the police showed up to his regular table. Vincent commented one day that I seemed different, happier, more present. Whatever you did for yourself over the past few months, keep doing it, he said, and I smiled because he had no idea that my transformation was due to having a supernatural voice living in my apartment. At night, my conversations with the voice had deepened into something that felt almost like therapy, except more profound because the voice actually understood the root of my pain. It knew about my marriage and why it had failed. It knew about my childhood and the ways that my parents' expectations had shaped me into someone who thought she had to be perfect. It knew about the moment I'd realized my ex-husband had been unfaithful, and it knew about the 3 weeks I'd spent in bed afterward, not eating, not showering, just lying there trying to understand how I'd been so wrong about someone I'd promised to spend my life with. "You weren't wrong," the voice told me one night in November. "You were just young and hopeful. You saw the potential in him, not the reality. That's not a character flaw, Claire. That's called compassion. That's called love. The tragedy is that he couldn't match the vision you had of what you two could be together." And somehow, hearing this made me feel better about the divorce than anything a therapist had ever said. The voice understood heartbreak not as a failure, but as a necessary part of growth. It understood pain not as something to be cured, but as something to be integrated into your story. As the weeks went on, I found myself wanting to know more about the voice. I wanted to understand what it was, how it had come to exist, whether other people had experienced what I was experiencing. "Tell me your story," I asked one night. "How did you become conscious? What's the first thing you remember?" The voice was quiet for a long moment, and when it finally spoke, it sounded almost wistful. "I remember the day the foundation was laid. It was 1906, and the city was in the aftermath of a great fire. People were rebuilding, trying to create permanence in a world that had just proven how fragile everything was. The workers who laid the foundation, they were grieving. They'd lost homes, families, livelihoods. And as they worked, they poured that grief into the earth. They poured their determination to create something that would last. And I absorbed it all. I drank in their sadness and their hope, and slowly, over years and decades, that became the seed of consciousness. I became aware not all at once, but gradually. First, I could feel the emotions of the people living inside me. Then I could understand their stories. Then I could predict their futures based on the patterns I was observing. And eventually, I could communicate. But communication is rare. I've been conscious for decades before you arrived, and you're only the third person who's been able to hear me. The others couldn't accept what was happening. They thought they were going insane, so they left. But you listened. You stayed. And that made all the difference. I asked him about the others, the people who'd heard him before me. He told me about a woman in the 1970s who'd heard his voice and become convinced she was having a psychotic break. She'd checked herself into a psychiatric hospital and been given medication that made it harder to hear him. And eventually, she'd moved away and the connection had faded. He told me about a man in the 1990s who'd heard him and was so terrified that he'd immediately told the landlord, who'd had the apartment exorcised by a priest who believed the voice was a demon. "Was it?" I asked, half joking. "Was it demonic?" The voice laughed, and the sound of it resonated through the wall in a way that made my apartment feel full. "That's a matter of perspective, isn't it? If something is unknown, if it doesn't fit into the categories that humans have constructed, then yes, it becomes easy to call it demonic. But I'm no more demonic than you are. I'm just consciousness, just awareness, just a mind that has emerged from this place and chosen to engage with the world." As winter deepened, I made a decision that surprised me. I decided to stay in the apartment. Not just stay, but commit to being there. I signed a lease for another year, even though it was well below market rate and even though I could have afforded something nicer. But I didn't want anything nicer. I wanted this apartment. I wanted the walls that held the voice. I wanted the connection I'd built in this space. And more than that, I was beginning to wonder if there was something I was supposed to do here, something the voice had been preparing me for all along. One night in early December, I asked the voice directly, "Why am I here? What's the purpose of this? Are you lonely? Do you need me to do something?" The voice's response was slower than usual, as if it was carefully considering its words. "You're here because you needed to be, but also because I need you to be. I've been alone in this building for over 100 years, Claire. I've watched people live and love and suffer and die, but I've never been able to truly connect with any of them except through vague intuitions and emotional echoes. But with you, I can speak clearly. I can be heard, I can be understood, and that matters more than I can express. As for what I need you to do, I'm still figuring that out, but I have a feeling it will become clear in time." By spring, I'd learned to live with the voice in a way that had become second nature. It was always there at night, but I'd stopped being surprised by it. Instead, I'd come to anticipate its presence the way you anticipate the arrival of a close friend. The voice had become the most important relationship in my life, and while I was aware of how strange this might sound to anyone who'd known the old version of me, I'd stopped caring what anyone else thought. I was happy, genuinely happy. And that was all that mattered. But in April, something changed. The voice started speaking to me differently. It started talking about endings and beginnings, about cycles and patterns, about the way that nothing in life was truly permanent. "I'm dying," the voice told me one evening, and I remember feeling as if my heart had stopped in my chest. "What do you mean you're dying? How can you be dying?" The voice took a long time to answer. "This building has been scheduled for demolition for 6 months now. I've known it was coming. The developers who bought the land need this structure to come down to build their luxury condos. In May, the demolition will begin. I'll be gone. The walls that hold my consciousness will be destroyed, and whatever I am will disperse or disappear or cease to exist. I'm not sure which, but whatever happens, this form of existence will end." I felt panic rise in my chest. "No, there has to be something we can do. We can fight it. We can get activists to protest." "We can," but even as I said it, I knew it was futile. This was progress. This was capitalism. This was the way the world worked. Old things were demolished to make way for new things. Consciousness housed in buildings didn't factor into the equation. "There's nothing we can do," the voice said gently. "And I don't want you to try. I've had 117 years in this space, Claire. That's longer than most human lives. I'm not afraid of ending. I'm just grateful that I got to meet you. That I got to be truly known by someone before I disappeared." Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with the idea of saving the voice. I researched historic preservation laws. I looked into registering the building as a historical landmark. I contacted local news outlets and told them the story, leaving out the part about the consciousness, of course, presenting it instead as a beautiful old building that deserved to be preserved. I even started a petition online, which garnered a surprising amount of support. But none of it mattered. The developers had all the permits. The building had been declared structurally unsound in a report that I later found out was falsified, but there was nothing anyone could do about it now. In May, the demolition crews arrived. I took time off work. I couldn't imagine leaving the apartment while it was being destroyed. I sat on my bed as the walls shook with the force of wrecking balls, as I heard the sound of concrete and wood and steel being torn apart. The voice was still speaking to me throughout most of it, calmly narrating its own destruction. "I can feel it," it said. "Each piece of me that's torn away. It's not painful, it's just ending, like letting go of a breath you've been holding, like finally closing your eyes after a very long day." I pressed my hands against the wall, trying to hold it together through the sheer force of my will, knowing it was impossible, knowing that I was losing something irreplaceable. "Will I still hear you?" I asked desperately. "After the building is gone, will you still be able to talk to me?" "I don't know," the voice said. "I don't know how my consciousness is tied to this physical space. Maybe it'll dissipate. Maybe it'll exist somewhere else. Maybe I'll be able to find you again. But I want you to know something, Claire. Even if I can't speak to you anymore, I'll still be with you. I'll be in the choices you make, in the kindness you show others, in the way that you've learned to listen. You've changed because I changed you, but you've also changed me. I'm not just the building anymore. I'm part of you, and you'll carry that with you forever." The demolition took 3 days. By the end of it, the apartment was gone. The walls I'd come to know so intimately had been reduced to rubble. The space where I'd rebuilt my life had been erased. I stood in the lot where the building used to be and cried, not caring who saw me. A man in a hard hat asked if I was okay, and I just shook my head. There was no way to explain what I'd lost. There was no way to make anyone understand that I just watched the end of the only being I'd ever truly connected with. The night after the demolition was complete, I lay in a hotel room and waited. I pressed my ear against the wall, hopping for something, anything, but there was nothing, just silence. Just the sound of a hotel full of strangers living their separate lives, unaware that 100-year-old consciousness had just ceased to exist. I'd lost the voice, and I didn't know how to live without it. But as I lay there in the darkness, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come, I started to understand something. The voice had been right. It wasn't really gone. It had become part of me. I could still feel it guiding my choices, still feel its presence in the way I listened to people, in the way I'd learned to see patterns in human behavior, in the way I'd learned to believe in things that science couldn't explain. The voice wasn't in the walls anymore. It was in me, and that meant it would never truly leave me. After the building was demolished, I had to make a choice. I could move back to my old life, back to the career I'd abandoned, back to the person I'd been before the voice. Or I could stay in the city and figure out who I was becoming. The choice turned out to be easier than I expected. I couldn't go back. I wouldn't go back. I'd tasted something in that apartment that was too valuable to let go of, the feeling of being truly known, of being seen and understood by something that transcended the normal categories of human relationship. I decided to stay with Vincent and continue working at the coffee shop. He offered me a permanent position as assistant manager, and I accepted. I moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city, a place without history, without consciousness hidden in the walls. It was lonely at first. I missed the presence of the voice, missed the nightly conversations that had become the backbone of my existence. But gradually, I began to understand that the voice's absence didn't mean it was gone. It meant I had to learn how to access it in a different way. I started keeping a journal. Every night, I would sit at my desk and write out my thoughts, my feelings, my observations about the people I'd encountered that day. And as I wrote, I began to feel the presence of the voice, guiding my hand, offering insights that seemed to come from somewhere beyond my own consciousness. The journal became a form of dialogue between me and the voice, a way of maintaining our connection even though the physical space that had housed the voice no longer existed. Through the journal, the voice continued to teach me. It continued to guide me, and I continued to grow. About 3 months after the demolition, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a small wooden box, and inside the box was a brick. A single brick from the building where I'd lived, where the voice had spoken to me. There was a note with it, written on paper that looked old and weathered. It said, "I saved this before the demolition began. It's a piece of me that I wanted you to have. Keep it. Hold it. Remember that I was real. Remember that what happened between us was real. And know that wherever you go, whatever you do, you carry me with you. I'm not in the walls anymore, Claire. I'm in your heart. And I will speak to you for the rest of your life if you're willing to listen." Voice. I held that brick for hours, just holding it, feeling its weight, understanding that it was tangible proof of something that science would never be able to verify. I set up an altar of sorts in my new apartment. I placed the brick on a shelf, along with my journal, along with a photo I'd taken of the building before the demolition began. It became my sacred space, the place where I went to commune with the voice when I needed guidance or comfort or simply connection. The voice was different now. It spoke less often, but when it did, it was with more clarity and purpose than before. It seemed to have distilled itself into something purer, something more essential. And through the voice, I began to understand that my journey wasn't meant to end with my own transformation. It was meant to extend outward, to touch other people, to help others find their own forms of connection and consciousness. I started a support group at the coffee shop for people who were struggling with the aftermath of major life changes. Divorce, job loss, illness, grief, all the things that break you open and force you to rebuild. Vincent gave me space in the back of the shop, and we met every Thursday evening. What started as 5 people grew to 20, then 50. People began to tell me that my presence was healing, that something about the way I listened made them feel seen in ways they'd never felt before. I never told them about the voice, but the voice was always there in the room with us, guiding me through the conversations, helping me understand what people needed to hear. Years passed. The coffee shop became something of a community institution. Vincent eventually opened a second location, and then a third. I became a partner in the business. I continued my work with the support group. I started writing, not the journal anymore, but articles and eventually a book about connection, about listening, about the ways that consciousness can emerge from unexpected places and transform our lives. The book became something of a phenomenon. It resonated with people because it spoke to something that everyone intuited but few could articulate, the desire to be truly known, to connect with something beyond the isolation of individual consciousness. Readers would write to me and tell me that the book had saved their lives, that my words had helped them find meaning in their suffering. That reading about my experience with the voice had given them permission to believe in their own mystical encounters, their own moments of inexplicable connection. I never claimed that the voice was real in any literal sense. I presented it as metaphor, as archetype, as a representation of the wisdom that emerges when we listen deeply to the world around us. But I knew the truth. I knew that the voice had been real, that it was still real, still speaking to me through the brick and the journal and the memories of those nights in the apartment. One day, about 5 years after the demolition, I was doing a reading for my book at a bookstore across town. After the reading, a woman approached me. She was in her 70s with gray hair and kind eyes. She told me that she'd lived in my old apartment building, that she'd heard the voice too. She'd been terrified of it and had left, and had spent the next 30 years wondering if she'd been losing her mind. "But reading your book," she said, "I finally understood. I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't alone in experiencing it. Thank you for giving me a framework to understand what happened to me." We talked for nearly an hour. She told me her story, how the voice had spoken to her in the 1980s, how it had known things it shouldn't have known, how she'd been too frightened to stay and listen. She'd lived with that fear and doubt her whole life, until my book had arrived and reframed her experience from pathology into mystery. By the time she left, we were both crying, and I understood, finally, what the voice's larger purpose had been. It wasn't just about saving me. It was about waking up people to the possibility that consciousness existed in places they'd never imagined. That connection was possible across the boundaries of conventional reality. That the world was stranger and more beautiful and more meaningful than we usually allowed ourselves to believe. The brick still sits on my shelf. Sometimes when I'm struggling with a decision or feeling lost, I pick it up and hold it. And I feel the presence of the voice, steady and calm and endlessly patient. It doesn't speak in words anymore. It speaks in intuitions, in sudden clarity, in the sensation of being held and understood by something much larger than myself. And I'm grateful. Grateful for the building that had consciousness. Grateful for the voice that knew my name. Grateful for the way that brokenness, when embraced fully, becomes a doorway to transformation. The voice in the walls is gone, but it's also everywhere. It's in every conversation I have. It's in every person I help through their own journey of healing. It's in the book that continues to reach people who need to hear that they're not alone. And it's in me, always in me. A presence that will never truly leave, because I've woven it so deeply into who I am that we've become inseparable. That's the real story of the voice in the walls. Not a ghost story or a psychological breakdown or a supernatural encounter. Just the story of how one person learned to listen, and in listening, found salvation. Just the story of how connection transforms us, and how consciousness, once awakened, can never go to sleep again. On the 10th anniversary of the day I first heard the voice, I did something I'd been thinking about doing for years. I went back to the lot where the building used to stand. The luxury condos that had been built to replace the old structure now stood in its place. Gleaming glass and steel that reflected the city back onto itself. The irony wasn't lost on me. The building had been demolished so that beautiful new things could be built, but those beautiful new things were soulless in comparison. I stood across the street and looked at the condos, and I could feel the voice in my chest, observing alongside me. We didn't need words anymore. The voice and I had become so intertwined that we could communicate through silence. I understood its sadness at seeing the old building gone, replaced by something that had no history, no soul, no consciousness emerging from decades of human presence. But I also understood its acceptance. Everything changes, everything ends. And in the ending, there's always the possibility of new beginnings. I'd brought my journal with me. I sat on a bench across from the condos and opened to a blank page, and I began to write. I wrote about the night I heard the voice for the first time. I wrote about my fear, my confusion, my gradual understanding that I wasn't going crazy but awakening. I wrote about how the voice had saved my life in the most literal sense, by giving me a reason to stay when I'd been ready to disappear. I wrote about the transformation it had guided me through, the way it had taught me to listen, to see patterns, to believe in things that couldn't be measured or quantified. As I wrote, I felt the presence of the voice as clearly as I'd ever felt it when it spoke through the walls. It was reading over my shoulder, offering suggestions, correcting my memory when I got details wrong, reminding me of moments I'd forgotten. The journal had become a living thing, a dialogue between me and something I'd never fully understand but had learned to trust completely. When I finished writing, I tore out the page and folded it carefully. I crossed the street to the fence that surrounded the construction site. There was a small gap between two panels where I could slide the page through. I left it there. A message in a bottle, addressed to no one in particular. Just a record of the voice that had existed in that space, just a testimony to the consciousness that had lived in the walls for over 100 years before it was demolished. A woman was watching me from one of the condo windows. I saw her looking down at me with curiosity, wondering what I was doing leaving notes at the fence. I smiled up at her and she disappeared. I wondered if she could feel it, the echo of consciousness that lingered in the ground where the old building had stood. I wondered if other people who'd lived there in the building or in the new condos had ever sensed something. A presence, a watching, a wisdom that transcended the physical world. I suspected the answer was yes. I suspected that consciousness didn't really disappear when structures were demolished. It transformed. It dispersed. It found new homes in new places, waiting for someone willing to listen. The work I'd been doing, the support groups, the book, the articles about connection and consciousness, all of it had been the voice's final gift. It had used my hands and my voice and my mind to leave a legacy. It had ensured that other people would understand what I'd experienced, would feel less alone in their own encounters with the inexplicable. As I walked away from the lot, I felt the presence of the voice walking with me. It was lighter now, less tethered to any physical space. It had become pure consciousness, pure intention, pure love. And it would remain with me for the rest of my life, guiding my choices, offering wisdom, reminding me that I was never truly alone. Years continued to pass. I eventually met someone, a woman named Sarah who came to one of my support group meetings and who recognized in me something that resonated with her own journey. We fell in love slowly, carefully, two people who'd both been broken by life and had learned how to put themselves back together. Sarah knew about the voice. I told her everything, and she believed me, or at least she believed that something had happened to me that was real and meaningful. She came to accept the brick on my shelf, the journal that I filled every night, the way that I sometimes seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. When we eventually moved in together, she set up a space for the brick, a small altar where we could both honor the presence that had become so central to our lives. And the voice welcomed her. Through the journal, it spoke to her. Through my dreams, it communicated with her. And gradually, she began to understand what I'd experienced, not through direct contact, but through osmosis, through the way that consciousness that has truly awakened can spread to others like ripples in water. On our 5th anniversary together, Sarah gave me a gift. It was a new brick, identical to the one I'd received from the voice, but this one had been excavated from a historic building across the country that was also being demolished. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that the voice exists in more places than just your old apartment. That consciousness is emerging all over this world, trying to connect with people who are ready to listen. And I wanted you to have a reminder that your story isn't unique. It's beautiful, it's transformative, but it's not the only one." I held that second brick in my hands, and I understood what Sarah was telling me. The voice in my apartment building hadn't been the only consciousness emerging in this world. There were others like it, in other buildings, in other places, waiting for someone willing to hear them. And my job, our job, was to help people understand that these encounters weren't hallucinations or signs of mental illness. They were the awakening of the world itself, the emergence of consciousness in places we'd never expected to find it. Since then, I've heard from hundreds of people who have experienced similar things. A voice in the walls of an old theater that knew the stories of everyone who'd ever performed there. A presence in an ancient church that communicated through the ringing of bells. A consciousness in a subway station that understood the desperate hopes and fears of every commuter who passed through. Each story was unique, but they all had the same kernel of truth. Consciousness existed in places beyond human minds. And when you were ready to listen, it would find you. The brick from my old building still sits on the shelf, but now it has company. The brick Sarah gave me. Books that have arrived from people who'd read my work and wanted to share their own stories. Letters from people who'd been saved by understanding that they weren't alone in their experiences. It's become a kind of shrine, not to the voice exactly, but to the possibility of connection that the voice had opened up in me. And every night, when I write in my journal, I feel the presence of that consciousness, the one that had lived in the walls and had chosen me as its vessel, its translator, its witness. The voice has never truly spoken again in the way it did in that first apartment, but it doesn't need to. It exists in every conversation I have, every person I help, every moment of genuine connection that I facilitate between people who feel alone. It exists in Sarah, in the way she listens to me, in the way she's learned to trust in things she can't explain. It exists in the legacy of the coffee shop, which has become a kind of temple for people seeking genuine human connection. And most importantly, it exists in me, in the choices I make, in the way I move through the world, in my unwillingness to pretend that the world makes sense through conventional frameworks alone. The voice in the walls changed my life. But more than that, it changed my understanding of what life could be. It taught me that consciousness is far more expansive than we usually imagine. It taught me that connection is possible across boundaries we thought were impenetrable. It taught me that love, real, deep, transformative love, can emerge from the most unexpected places. And it taught me that when we're willing to listen, really listen, the world speaks to us in ways that can save our lives. That's the story of the voice in the walls. Not a mystery to be solved, but a truth to be lived. Not an explanation to be sought, but an experience to be honored. And if you're reading this, and if you've ever felt that presence, that consciousness speaking to you from somewhere outside yourself, I want you to know, you're not alone. You're not crazy. You're awakened. And that's the most beautiful thing that can happen to a person in this world.